Welcome to Going Deep, Brandon Angelo. If you have not seen his classroom work on, it's not just on X, but you can find it on X. The classroom, his film viewing and evaluations. You can find it at his site, Angelo's Analysis, and I would definitely check it out. He's got some really good ones available for free to check out, and then check out the rest of his work. And you know me, I'm that guy on Alone, the NFL version, as you can see right now. I'm on day 100 and whatever, in my rock house, and we've managed to catch enough fish, and they did allow me a hunting dog, so I think I'm okay at least through April 1st.
There you go.
There we go. So today we're gonna kick it off. I was having a conversation with my buddy Sigmund Bloom this afternoon. And he asked me if I had heard about Max Toscano's conversation about tight ends and where the tight end position may be heading based on what we saw last year. And I had not. And I'm going to summarize it as best I can. This is, telephone game stuff from, Bloom telling me about it. And so, but essentially it is that you look at like A.J. Barner, and I would add Tucker Kraft or even Tyler Warren as higher-end versions of this. But these are bigger guys who may not be the, man-to-man matchup, mismatches. They're guys who operate in zones. They can rumble when they get the ball. But what they're known for, at least Kraft and definitely A.J. Barner, is that they can block their ass off. And the theory Max has offered, a former tight end at Connecticut, I believe, is that because NFL teams are taking away spread offenses, they're using all the umbrella coverages. Now teams are actually having to run in order to pass, and they're using heavier sets to run the ball, and then the passing that they're doing is more with tight ends that they can either split out or they can run from 12 and different variations of 12 and 13 and get value out of those guys. And when you look at what A.J. Barner did, he's a great example of that because he's terrific in the shallow zone and terrific in the red zone, very reliable pass catcher. But it takes more coverage reading to knowing what spot you're going to go to than it does skill one-on-one to beat a man, in terms of that type of skill set. So the idea is that maybe the riskier guys are going to be the tight ends who are the move tight ends, the route runners, and the things like that. So what do you think about that? Do you think that has teeth? Where does it have teeth? Where may it be a little toothless?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I think Toscano's kind of hit the nail on the head because in today's game, we're looking a lot more at 12 and 13 personnel, like we were looking at 11 personnel like 6, 7, 8 years ago when Tyreek Hill was dominating the league at level 3. But now we're getting into more of we're going to utilize a higher end tight end as a blocker who can, like you mentioned, your Tyler Warrens, your Tucker Crafts can rumble a bit in space. And then every once in a while, we'll get a unicorn type player like your Brock Bowers of the world, like your Colston Lovelands of the world, who can do both at a fairly high level and kind of play the chess piece role too, right? And I think Trey McBride's more of that move tight end. So that's kind of the interesting thing is, it's harder to find guys in that archetype who can actually block really well to be an asset in 12 and 13 personnel. And that's the big deal is we're looking now at guys who can be assets. I think in this class, you have guys like Eli Stowers, right?
Right.
And it's interesting because he's more of that move tight end. I mean, he's closer to a slot receiver than a traditional inline guy. And it's going to be harder for those guys to catch on and stay relevant like you have, in this free agent cycle, like Isaiah Likely, right? It's like guys like that it's a little difficult to project them as a inline role in an offense that runs a lot of 12 and 13 personnel, which is a lot more offenses in today's game. So I think that definitely has teeth. And I'm honestly really interested to see how guys like Stowers and some of these other guys who are more move tight ends, guys who can play in the slot and a bit outside, where they get drafted because there's not really much of a commotion surrounding that archetype of player in today's game. So it's kind of like how, you know, the big time, big carry power back got kind of phased out. You don't see your Steven Jacksons of the world walking around and getting 30 carries a game for 115 yards and a cloud of dust on most of them. I think this is kind of the same deal where we're entering this era of tight ends that you're an inline first player, and then your plus is if you are an extension of the receiving game. And I think that's a really interesting kind of shift in terms of offensive football that we're seeing now as we approach 2025 plus.
Yeah, I think it has teeth too, and I think for all the reasons you mentioned, I would even say that if we're going to refine it, I think there's always going to be room for your elite move tight ends. I think that like Brock Bowers and Trey McBride to me are good examples of guys who I would both argue that aren't great blockers. I think Brock is okay at what he does. Colston Loveland's more of a unicorn, I would argue.
Sure.
Where and like George Kittle, like they can do everything. Whereas what I think what makes Brock compelling is he could be your wide receiver one. He's good enough as a wide receiver to be your wide receiver one. So they're not going to take him off the field for a wide receiver 3 or a wide receiver 4. And I think that's where Bloom brought up a good point that we were talking about this afternoon is that, your tight end 1 is going to have to be better than your wide receiver 3 and wide receiver 4 to be on the field enough times to get fantasy relevant points and to get statistically relevant value that gets them labeled a top end starter. So like Dalton Kincaid, does he wind up in a situation where you could say with the Bills receivers as it is right now, the answer is yes, he's still probably one of their top 3 receivers. But will that change in free agency and in the draft? And will it change with with any changes that they make? Jackson Hawes probably becomes a lot more appealing because he is already the best blocker on that depth chart, and that's not saying anything lightly, considering that Dawson Knox is pretty good in that area.
Right.
So if Jackson Hawes learns how to catch, suddenly now you're looking at a player that might be on the front end of the wave of changes that we're beginning to see if this is actually that wave. So Jackson Hawes could be your next A.J. Barner type of player where you go, yeah, we drafted Elijah Arroyo, but the blocker, the guy who's really getting the job done for us in the red zone and where he's just getting free money because, they believe that he's going to block is A.J. Barner. So I can see how we start looking at some of these players, and you brought up this topic that we wanted to discuss, which is the riskiest prospects in the cycle, and I wanted to kick off the program with Max's tight end idea because one of my riskiest prospects in the cycle is Michael Trigg. And Kenyon Sadiq, both of them really. Like I have them right. I have Eli Stowers number 1, and I feel like that he's close enough to being good enough that he will probably be no worse than the wide receiver 3 for a team, because he's so good around the ball and he can run after the catch. And I think that there's enough to his game that can grow that teams might go, we feel good about him being our tight end / wide receiver 3 in 12 personnel. Like I could see how that might happen, but it's still risky. This class is riskier than the last class. But the 2 and 3 for me are and this should lead into another topic I'm going to mention is I'm going to actually change my metrics, my grading, and have an additional grade for tight end where the weight is more towards blocking,
Mm-hmm.
and or at least I'm going to change the scoring dynamic so that the percentages are different. So I'm going to give what I'm usually given, and I'm going to give this one in case this wave begins to stick. And I want to kind of get in on it and
Yeah, I like that.
change that a little bit and say, look, if you're a team that runs 12, here's how this is going to be ranked. If you're a team that's still thinking that, or if you're a team that thinks that you're going to get a receiver, a tight end who's going to be at least your wide receiver two, more likely one or two on your depth chart, and or on your on the field for you, and you feel like you can live with them getting those snaps, then this is how it's ranked. So how it's ranked right now is in that area, like the traditional way with the receiving heavy. I've got Trigg and Sadiq 2 and 3, but I didn't feel good about it at all, because especially Trigg, because when you watch Trigg, he's kind of a running back in open space, which is nice. I like that element of his game. He can break a lot of tackles, and he's got good balance. But when you watch him catch the ball, it becomes a really fun evaluation conundrum, because in good moments, he flashes excellent technique at the catch point, and he makes elite catches, like really difficult plays, displays of acrobatic skill, and can do it in contact. So when you see that, that's great. And so the question is, all right, so do I grade him based on the fact that he's exhibited good technique with that high level of play? Or do I look at the other end of the spectrum, which is on the next play, he doesn't even look like he knows the correct technique that he just displayed.
Sure.
And the ball looks like it's some sort of, sea mine that has been taken out, out of the ocean with all the old-fashioned ball with the spikes that they showed in the old black and white movies. And they tossed that thing at him and told him that if his hands hit it too hard, it might explode. He literally looks like a Jekyll and Hyde player in that regard. And so when you add those two things together, plus the fact that he's 240 or like just below that, or somewhere in that 235, 245 range, I forgot what the combine number was, but he's in that range, and you go, all right, so I remember Orson Charles way back in the day. Do any of you even know whose that guy's name is? That guy was about the same size, really fast, could catch really well out of Tampa, Florida, just like Michael Trigg. And it's just kind of like, will he be forgotten as well? Will he have a role? Will he be James Casey, like good at a lot of little things, but nothing really that will fit in today's NFL? So for me, like, where do you grade him? Because if I grade him conservatively and say he's got to show consistency with what we do, then I have him in a grade where he's more of a contributor, but not a rotational starter or a starter, because his hands are bring him down. But then the argument I would make, Brandon, is, and I ultimately made, is this. You could have said that about Brandon Marshall and Terrell Owens, probably with their hands at times. And did you bring them down for that, or did you say they exhibited the correct techniques at the right time? They exhibited them, and when they did them right, they made game-changing plays. And I think that, and along with everything else that they had to offer, you bet on that, and you lived with the bad. And generally, the good outweighed the bad with those two to a fair extent. If I do that, Michael Trigg's my number 2 tight end on my board if I'm looking at wide receiver value, as opposed to being 12th to 15th on my board of 25 that I've graded. So it's a big difference. And to me, when you throw in Max's theory, that's why A, he's the riskiest player on the board for me in this cycle, and B, why I'm going to be probably offering 2 different grade values just to give you an idea of, if he goes to a certain team, this is probably how he's going to be viewed. If he goes to another team that has an offense that's more of a benefit, this is where he could be, so that you have a little bit more intel in terms of what to do. But to me, that's the risk.
I love that. Yeah, and I think that's kind of spot on because we look at it kind of in a vacuum sometimes with prospects of they do this well, so they'll do this better at the next level. And that's a lot of times not the case. Sometimes it goes the opposite way. And, it depends on, a lot of times how the player is taught collegiately and then what's the learning curve to the NFL. And that's sometimes very, very stark in terms of being a contrast. But yeah, I agree with you with Trigg. I think it's the size and the athleticism and all that stuff is very tantalizing. And if he figures it out, he could be a pretty big time contributor for an NFL offense. However, if those shortcomings become long-standing issues, you're looking at a guy that's not going to be a contributor at all.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I know I 100% agree.
He's
And
just not much of a blocker at this stage
no,
either. Yeah.
correct. And that's the big thing is that's going to, especially in this era, like it's like Elijah Arroyo is a great example, like you brought up. Like out of Miami, he was, I mean, as athletic as you can get in terms of a prospect, but he did a lot in that needs work to poor category that saw a much lesser athlete in AJ Barner taking all of those snaps.
Yeah. So here's a question for you to follow up, and I want to know who one of your riskiest prospects in this cycle. Mm-hmm. But I mean, you look at this, and I mean, at the end of the day, does a guy like, to me, I think that the tipping point maybe for whether or not one of these move tight ends is going to be valuable is, can you see him being Delanie Walker? Because Delanie Walker was a good blocker for his size. Jordan Reed was a good blocker for his size. But can they be that? And because those guys were in the 240 range, probably. I mean, I know Reed was bigger, but he should have stayed at his 232 to 240 weight and probably wouldn't have gotten as banged up. I don't know if he would have gotten as banged up, but he got the injuries took a toll. But Walker had a long career, and he was a wide receiver, and like he was a adequate blocker, but good enough as a wide receiver that when the Titans ran two tight ends with Mariota under center, Walker was always a part of that.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because I think too with today's direction of offense, like you need your tight end's more important now than it was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think it's just going to be one of those two that it's going to take a while for some of these guys to get acclimated. I think too, if you're not a really high draft pick at tight end, like it's going to be hard for you to see the field initially.
Yeah. Because
if you're not valuing that position from a draft capital standpoint, like guys like obviously Warren and Loveland like have made massive impacts. And I remember before it was like, oh man, like 3 years ago it was like, oh, first round tight ends, man, rookie tight ends never make an impact. And now it's holy cow, like every year Bowers, Loveland, Warren, all these guys are making big time impacts because teams are investing much more in their trenches.
Yeah.
And the tight end is a part of that.
Yeah.
It's this big segment of it where 5-6 years ago, your tight end was more of a luxury as a part of your rushing attack and a more important part of what your wide receiver room is doing, a la your Travis Kelce's of like becoming big time players, like Rob Gronkowski in that era of football too, that obviously he did both at a high level, but that was a super big deal.
Yeah. I think you're going to need, either you're going to get mid to late round guys like Kraft and Barner, who are like good pass catchers, just not great route runners, who block really well, who move ahead of the guys that were drafted earlier than them, like Musgrave and Arroyo, or you're going to wind up with some of these mid-round guys who their blocking acclimates fast enough and they know that they can catch. So they're like, we can deal with a guy who can catch and get open in zone. And then the third option is this guy could play in any era because he's a weapon. at the
Right.
receiver position, whether he's an Ozzie Newsome-like weapon from way back in the 70s, or whether it's we could Todd Christensen in the 80s, you know, who and or or we're moving now into like Brock Bowers in this era, who I think was a better blocker than either of those two by a good stretch, but still you probably wouldn't put him on the same level as George Kittle as a blocker,
No, no,
not
no, no,
remotely,
for sure.
So okay, so again, yeah, who's your riskiest prospect in this class, or one of
Oh
them?
man, I would honestly say Jordan Tyson.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think it's kind of two pronged. I think the first prong in that is the injuries, right? I think we, a lot of times when we look at the injuries, we say, oh, well, it won't happen in the NFL. Well, if you kind of look at the injuries broad spectrum, multi ligament knee injury, 2022, ACL, MCL, PCL, played 9 games that year. Then in 2023, he played 3 games because of complications recovering from surgery. 24, fractured clavicle against Arizona, November, required surgery. And then last year in 25, hamstring strain against Texas Tech in October, played through it, returned after a few games, but was an obvious less than 100% upon return. So this is someone who's missed over a third of his collegiate games and wasn't able to work out at the combine due to a hamstring strain that is likely due to the multi-ligament knee injury. That's a big issue because what happens now is it's tougher to make two receiver sets because you're playing more 12 personnel, right? It's not like he's unlocked to see the field every single down. So let's say if in his first couple seasons he misses developmental time with injury, who's to say he's not just a situational starter in that juncture? And that's the issue is there's a lot the injury stuff, it should definitely give pause because if you're investing a top, 20 pick in this guy, it can be fairly difficult. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, he has tantalizing talent above the rim, can win the ball against anybody. But then the second rung of this for, concerns is there are a lot of times that defensive backs just out physical him. And it's not that he doesn't have the play strength. I think he benched, 225, like 26 times or something ridiculous. Strong kid. But there's a lot of like top of route stuff that is kind of wonky. I do think he has the ability to play inside and out. But I think it's also, too, it's like some people are saying this is the number one receiver in this class. But the one thing that I value more than anything is durability and your ability to be reliable for 17 plus games. And that's a huge deal. You're looking at teams that want to make a deep playoff run and you're playing 20 games.
Yeah.
Right? So it's tough. It's tough to say that this guy will be able to play 17 plus. I do love his above the rim skill set. I think he can develop into a Allen Robinson the second type receiver with the inside out versatility. I don't think he's as explosive as people think he is. He's actually fairly poor after the catch, which was kind of surprising when watching his tape.
Yes.
And that was a huge one. I thought, when you look at the gaudy numbers and the in-air athleticism, I thought that stuff would track to the post-catch work. But he was kind of a near zero in that category for me. And I was shocked because I thought he would offer more of those traits because he can also be a dynamic route runner at times. And that was fairly surprising when looking at his tape. I still have him, I believe right now, as my wide receiver 3 or 4. I still have him as a starter in the NFL, obviously, without Allen Robinson the second being the top of the rung comparable. But I think the floor is lower than most would like to admit because he was such a good prospect. But also with that, there's some shortcomings, obviously with the route running nuance and the wonkiness there at times. And then also, too, we have the ability to not really be a contributor post catch, which is kind of surprising.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned that because right now, and I'll be looking at receivers next in terms of finalizing grades and then writing up that for my RSP chapter probably after Friday or Saturday. But as it stands right now, and again, you guys know I don't do soap opera rankings, so I don't really talk about it until I'm really close, and I'm getting close enough. But he didn't score as a starter, an immediate starter in my rankings. Now he scored close, and he's definitely close to my top 5, but he's not in my top 5 as of this point, and he probably will make it in there from what it looks like. But it's based on his ability, I would have assumed the way people are talking that he'd be in the same tier as Carnell Tate and Mekhi Lemon.
100%.
And he's not.
No.
Like it's not even like I have 2 tiers, those 2 guys in these tiers, and then everyone else below, and he's in that 3rd tier. And it's because not just because of the durability, because that's a big deal, but for like you yourself, I have 5 tiers that I use for my grading to put people in with criteria to make those tiers. And it's like star ability, starter ability, committee ability, reserve, free agent, and then deficient. Just you're getting a 0. And for Jordan Tyson, in terms of like decision making as a runner, committee level, like that's just basically a guy off the bench who can be in part of your rotation. As power, same thing. Being able to break tackles and work through contact, committee level. His balance, same thing. I think was committee level. So yeah, all committee level, and those are qualities that when you're looking for, usually the top guys, they excel at least in one of those 3 areas.
Right. Your stars,
or 2. Yeah.
100% are always at least above serviceable after the catch.
Yes.
In at least one of those. Like you look at your Jamar Chases, your Puka Nakuas, your Justin Jeffersons.
Yeah.
Those type of guys. Like I'm sure I'm missing a couple of the superstars here, but all those guys are above serviceable after the catch. Jackson Smith-Njigba, like all those guys are above serviceable and do a great job. And even in the past, like guys like Cooper Kupp, like awesome after the catch. Yeah. And because they can win in different avenues. And I think for Tyson, that's an area where he really struggles, and it gets much harder when you're playing at Arizona State and you're not playing some of the best defenses, obviously.
Yeah.
And you go from that to
playing hurt in the NFL.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's different. And it's tough because you have to sometimes fall back on that too, because it's hard to get open. Right. If you do get space, you have to take advantage. And that's one thing, obviously, like same conference, like Tat McMillan. The one thing I liked about Tat McMillan was I thought if he's going to make a big splash, it's going to be after the catch.
Right.
I thought he was a really good after the catch receiver. I thought the other stuff he can grow into, and I thought he had a good year 1. I don't think it was as great as people are making it out to be. I think a lot of it was Jalen Coker missed a lot of time. Xavier Legette is a literal 0 as
they
an outside
manufactured
receiver.
a lot of offense for
Tat
McMillan.
You've literally no other choice. Jatavian Sanders missed time with injury, right? So big deal there. But yeah, I think going back to Tyson, it's hard to just look past all the shortcomings and then the durability and not be like, you know what, this might not work out. If it does, I think he has upside to being a Pro Bowler, right? Like Allen Robinson II. But I don't think he is a, Jamar Chase, Jackson Smith-Njigba level player. I think in the modern day game, I think you can see him maybe more of a Garrett Wilson type, where he's good for stretches, but not as dominant consistently as you'd ever think.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to give you one more.
Okay.
Mike Washington Jr.
I was about to say Washington Jr. because the big thing about Washington Jr. is you look at the players and prospects of his archetype, that big, fast, like big time play speed, right? Times well, looks the part. But how many of those guys are top five rushers consistently in the NFL? Because they can't ever really slow down the game. Like if you think about it, like that archetype of player, especially above guys who are like 225 plus pounds, the only one that comes to mind, and he had this trait up like obviously in college, Jonathan Taylor. That's really it. And he was just cognitively advanced as a rusher in college at Wisconsin. And I go back and watch his tape from time to time, and just incredibly adept at feeling gaps and openings and closures. Mike Washington is very reserve level in those categories, and doesn't take contact well, doesn't have a ton of solutions in open space. So it's like those guys who made themselves a lot of money at the combine, and that's awesome. I think that's a phenomenal thing. However, he is not, like, in my opinion, a day two prospect.
I would say I look at it this way. Two things stuck out for me. One was his footwork and elusiveness. Like how to me, there's timed elusiveness and there's functional elusiveness. And one of the things that I like to look for in a running back is how well do they vary their stride pacing and stride length? How well can they transition downhill from a perimeter path? Because when you're working downhill, you can see it right. But if you need 3 or 4 steps while you're moving towards the boundary and you've got to slow down those 3 or 4 steps to cut downhill, you're screwed because the defensive tackle's on top of you at that point, or the end, or the linebacker coming down the end, or the safety who run blitzed. Whoever it is, the pursuit is going to catch up with you. Ideally, you need to be able to do it in 1 step, and then functionally 1 to 2 steps most of the time is more than enough. You don't slow down that much. Washington was below that for me. But the big thing is, even if you disagree with Brandon and I about vision and play speed and the physicality of his game, that he doesn't translate it as well as it looks on paper, holding on to the football, okay?
Oh yeah,
when you
12, like how many times did he lose the football?
I can give it to you right here because I track this stuff, because 2 years ago I did a little bit of a preliminary look at ball handling. So Mike Washington has 5 seasons with 664 touches and 16 fumbles. Every year fumbling was an issue. So it wasn't like he had one awful year where he was hurt or something bad was going on.
Sure.
He averaged 1 fumble every 65 touches. Okay? That to me is the low end of the committee tier for me, of running backs, like a rotational reserve type of option that you have on the field, not your main cog ball carrier. And it's on the low end. It's literally... to me, it's 60 to 61. If you're 16 below, that's reserve level. You shouldn't be on the field because fumbling's a problem for you. And I tracked running backs for, I think, the past 10 years or 15 years. I think it was the past 15 years that I've been studying them for the RSP. And I tracked how many running backs who scored below a committee tier, how many of them had top 25 seasons, how many of them had top 15 seasons, how many have top 10 seasons, how many of them had top 3 seasons. And less than 10% of them were ever running back ones, much less elite. Like one guy, I think, was elite had an elite season.
Who was the elite season?
I don't remember. I gotta look. There's so much.
All right.
Yeah, I know. I should have prepared.
It's been a long time.
It's been a long time. But
that was an off-cuff question.
I wrote it. It should have been one I should have been prepared to answer. But it's at Football Guys. I wrote it a couple of summers ago when I looked at this because I was looking at Marshawn Lloyd and thinking, okay, everybody liked Marshawn Lloyd, but the guy fumbled like crazy. So am I making too much of this fumbling thing? But there's still possibility of like maybe I should cross-reference this with draft capital and see whether draft capital has an impact on that or not. So I may look into that next at some point down the line. But the fact that Mike Washington is only 5 touches away from being below the committee tier is a concern to me. And that's risky because say he had the way I have him graded now, while I agree with a lot of your points or some things that maybe I liked more than you did, at best, if he was at the star caliber tier, his grade would probably be, I would probably have him, let's see, probably he'd be in near my top 5 of running backs this year. Near that, maybe even in it. Especially now that with looking at the combine performance, I might, I don't give massive bumps for that, but I certainly it will make me go back and look at his speed and see if I was missing anything, and if I go, yeah, okay, I didn't see that as well as I should have. Let me bump up his let me give him a little bump to here. If I don't agree with that, then I'm like, well, screw the combine because Brandon Angelo told me about those 3 different types of devices they use to score speed, and and the NFL got the cheapest one or the second cheapest one if I remember correctly. But back in our first episode we did together. But I try to look at it and see that what's going on matches what I see on the field, and if it doesn't, I take the field over the test, the teaching to the test. But yeah, but that's the thing is like right now I have him as a contributor, like somebody that, plug him in, let him play short yardage if that's what you think he can do well, or if you think that he can be a finisher for you. As long as you super glue that, have super glue on his forearms, like before every he like can have a little dropper before every single snap.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think really like the high end rung of that ladder for him, I think, is probably a guy like Sean Tucker.
Right.
Like your Latavius Murray type. Like those are kind of the type of prospects. Chuba Hubbard's kind of in that mix in terms of that archetype, right?
Yeah.
People forget that Chuba Hubbard was a freaking sprint champion in Canada. No one knows that, which is hilarious. He used to be he ran for like over 2,000 yards at Oklahoma State. Like no one knows that. He was insane.
People
as
were,
a junior.
And it was funny because people were all over him until
then he went back to school, got hurt, fell in the draft.
Yep.
But good story. But nevertheless, I think with Washington, like you look at that archetype of back, and like those backs are not starters in today's game anymore.
Yeah.
Like there's really only a handful, and one being a high end starter in Jonathan Taylor. Besides that, like you're looking at potential contributor level players, none that are like super high end starters besides one. So yeah, he's definitely an interesting one in that regard.
Who's your next one? Do you have a second one?
He was my second one.
I'll give you a third for us to chew on.
Okay. I like to chew. Go ahead.
I like this guy. I really like this guy, but his combine performance may drop his draft capital to the point that it might not. Draft capital in politics might make him a guy that's got to force his way in. And in a tight running back market, it may not happen. It's Emmett Johnson of Nebraska.
Yeah, I actually agree with that because I think too with Johnson, like you like his tape in a very similar fashion to where, and this is my opinion, you could tell me if I'm an idiot, that I liked Bucky Irving and Devin Singletary.
Okay.
Like in a similar fashion, and you could tell like the play speed is not a winner for them anyways.
Right.
But what play speed is, like people forget Devin Singletary was a 3rd-round pick.
Right.
Like he got drafted right around David Montgomery. And that back today doesn't exist in the 3rd round.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the issue is you have draft capital working against you. And this year we actually had some really good backs that were drafted in the 6th, 7th round. Like you had your Monungai and Krosky Merritt. Both those guys I think had over 700 yards. But that's really rare. It doesn't happen often.
Yeah.
So you're gonna have to really fight for your touches and hopefully get in a thinner RB room like Chicago, like Washington, to where you can see some significant work. And I think with Johnson's game, a lot of the through contact skill set stuff is awesome. He does a phenomenal job working through different contact types and has a variety of tools that he uses to get through. But the NFL, openings and closures of space happen in such a difference to where they did it, Nebraska, where he's a Cornhusker. So, yeah, I think he'll be interesting. I like him, but I think it's going to be one of those. How late does a guy like that go?
Yeah.
Like, is he a 6th rounder now?
Yeah.
Like somebody asked me that and said, "Hey, like, do you think he goes in the 4th?" I'm like, "Oh man, I'd be shocked. I think he goes in the 6th."
Yeah.
5th round.
It's kind of like, to me, I fear that he's kind of going to be in a Trey Sermon-esque type of situation where, you look at Trey's game at Ohio State and at Oklahoma and you saw things that were really good, but he didn't have the explosion ultimately. And I think I probably overestimated his explosion. And overestimated his ability to see things at the level that he should have. If I were to look back on it, some of it is probably also that he got mismatched in the offense that he was in, and in terms of what they like to do and what they wanted from a back, and that might have also hurt his confidence some. But he's had plenty of opportunities to kind of build on things, and he has not looked explosive enough really in any setting that he's been in. And I think that's kind of a thing. So all right, so who's your sure thing that isn't a projected 1st or 2nd pick? For is a 1st round pick and 2nd round pick, or day 1, day 2 pick? It really doesn't make a difference. That's really what that is, right? So of day 1, day 2 pick.
Yeah.
Or 1st or 2nd.
I'll go as far as day 2 plus.
Okay.
And mine's going to be Skyler Bell out of UConn. I think he's showed enough to where I think he's going to be a contributor plus. I like the way he plays. He actually had a really good combine too, which I think will help his stock. But I mean, great tempo and variation as a ball carrier. Like that's the 2 things, right? Can you win as a boots on the ground player, and can you win when the ball's in the air? He can do both those things. I think it's always interesting to watch a player that is so easily the vocal point of an offense. Like he only had 1 game under 6 receptions this whole last year, and that was a game where he went like 4 for 135 and 2. Like he played some really, really good ball this year. I just think he's intelligent and abrupt on double moves, uncovers quickly in the slot. The one game I think that's good to watch in a bad way is Syracuse. Like he gets bullied when tracking in that game when it's not clean. But I do think he's a player that can play in 11 personnel almost immediately in the right situation, and maybe work his way up into starting in 12P. So for me, that was my bigger one. Probably a day 3 guy. I think he's probably, closer to round 4, round 5. But wouldn't be shocked if the team takes a shot at him in the 3rd. Smart, instinctive, plays well with the ball in his hands, tracks the heck out of the football. and is good in a lot of areas.
Yeah, before this weekend when I start reviewing combine stuff and rewatching tape and pinpointing different things, Bell's my 10th receiver on my board right now. So
Awesome.
I've and he's only a point away from my guy that I'll list, who might end up being drafted a little earlier than day 3 or in the 3rd round. But it's Antonio Williams of Clemson.
Yeah, love it.
I kind of feel like watching him play, he has the play speed to go deep on you, but he also gives you the toughness at the catch point. He can go up and win it. So when I combine some of those things, I feel like he can be an inside outside guy, and maybe he's like the guy that people think they see when they see KC Concepcion, and I like KC Concepcion, and I have him rated higher, but
Sure.
I do think one of the things that made me kind of smile a little bit when I looked at a combine highlight this week is I saw KC Concepcion going through the gauntlet. And
Yeah, I know
did
where
you
you're
see?
going with
Yeah,
this.
they're going through the gauntlet.
I did.
And I saw
I did.
multiple,
I
I
did.
saw multiple peers who were very good at what they do, but I saw multiple ones going, looks really smooth. Maybe he's alleviated the concerns about his hands. And I watched it, and I was like, okay, there's 7 catches he had to make, and 6 of them clearly his hands were far apart and they were clapping onto the football each time. He just made the catch. So it looked smooth to the untrained eye in terms of if you're not training it on what the technique actually is of the catch. And I was like, wow, 6 out of 70 clap attack. That's pretty much what the problem's been with him, if you ask me. Now, it doesn't mean that he's a bad player. And one of the things that I want to point out to people is that, part of scouting is being able, at least from my perspective, is being able to point out flaws that players have with their skills. So if the results don't come, you have somewhere to begin with where to help them get better. And whether that's the player themselves doing it or whether it's their coaches and saying, hey, you're dropping a lot of balls. I notice that every ball you've dropped has been a ball away from your frame, and you're bringing your hands together as the ball arrives, as opposed to having your hands together when before the ball gets there. Maybe you should start with that, because I'm seeing that here's the chain of events that happen when you do this. This looks like the root cause, and I think that there are a lot of it's hard to do. Like if you're going to ask somebody to run at full speed, bring their hands up and leap at the last second and have their hands perfectly together like this, or like this, depending on how people want it taught.
Right.
At sometimes it's hard to do that when your arms are literally stretched out to their maximum above their head. You really have to have trained that to become muscle memory or away from your frame. I see a lot of guys clapping like this when they're way ahead of their frame because they didn't anticipate the ball to be there. And sometimes that's going to happen even with the best players. But if it's the norm rather than the exception, that's where you go, okay, this is where problems can occur. And when I watch Concepcion, that's where I think problems can occur. He still has a good grade for me, a near instant starter. But that is one of those things that I look at and go, well, if he struggles, you're going to know why, because it's probably because this has been there for a while. And so keep an eye on that. This is why, maybe if people are going to put him in the same tier and you're a savvy fantasy drafter, for instance, and you're thinking, oh, they're all putting him in the same tier as Mekhi Lemon and Carnell Tate, maybe you can trade the rights for him and get the value of the pick if if people are valuing Concepcion in that range. Whereas, maybe,
Right.
and then you might be able to get something better out of it, those types of things. But yeah, he's, to me, like I look at Antonio Williams and I go, maybe that's what they see when they see KC Concepcion. He's a little more finished product version of Concepcion at the catch point,
Yeah.
at the very least. So
Yeah. No, I don't disagree with that.
All right, so all right. Shall we move on to our next one? What do you say? Do we next one, or do you have another one you want to? Nope.
No,
Okay.
that's perfect.
All right. So who's a player you have vastly different in terms of your grade than what you've seen or heard thus far? We've already covered Mike Washington. We've already covered Jordan Tyson. Those guys are definitely candidates from what we've seen. Is there anybody else that you would say I'm either vastly higher or vastly lower than what at least I've perceived to be the case from around what's going on around me? I might have frozen Brandon with that question. There we are. Okay.
You did freeze me with that question. Mine was actually Mike Washington.
Okay.
I think that's the big one. We talked about Jordan Tyson. I'm not even that low on him.
Right.
I think those are probably the main ones that consensus. Because I think right now, like there's like five, 6, 7 receivers that are kind of like in that range. In the consensus, running back is really unique because you have Love, then Price, then drop off in terms of potential. I mean, probably day 3.
Right.
So for me, I think Washington is the one because I think people think he's going to be slotted in the day 2, which he very well may be.
Yeah.
But I do think with Washington, there's so much risk with him just not panning out the way people think. Unless he gets into like an elite offensive line, it's going to be tough. Kind of like Caleb Johnson in a way.
Yeah.
Where it was like he just needs a big time wide zone scheme. If he gets into an offense that kind of varies their run concepts and calls and asks him to do a little bit more, he struggles, and that's what happened his rookie season. And he might never find traction in the league. We don't know that. And because he's the third back in that offense and was very clearly not ready to see an NFL field. And that's my worry with Washington is we see another Caleb Johnson because they have not dissimilar players, but in terms of, not having the requisite skill set for an NFL offense, they share some of those similarities. Obviously, Washington's big one is ball security.
Yeah. I've got one that I'm much higher on the consensus with, and I'm going to be, until we see that I'm just completely nuts about this, I'm going to be scratching my head why he was not invited to the Combine this weekend. And that's BYU tight end, former Utah and former UCLA guy, Carson Ryan. Wow. Like, to me, I watched this guy and then today, as I was finalizing my rankings, I was spot watching different things with different players, and I'm going, how did this guy get invited over Carson Ryan? How did this guy get invited over Carson Ryan? Are you kidding me? How did this guy, Carson Ryan is probably going to be my 5th ranked tight end as it comes out. And it's very possible that he could, if this whole idea that the tight end landscape is going to change and what's valued, he could wind up being my top tight end on the board because this dude can block at 6'4", 250. He's not the biggest dude in the world. You're not expecting him to line up against defensive ends one-on-one all the time, but he is savvy. I mean, okay. Most people when they study blocking with tight ends, from what I've seen in the draft sphere, and I'm not saying like the scouts, but people in the draft sphere, does he look like he can develop into a blocker? And then they're like, yeah, and then that's where they give the projection of it. Okay, yes, all right, he can get in the way. He gets in the way, man. He really throws his body in there. Oh, look how strong he is with that. Look how quick he is, and it's just kind of like, okay, so are you looking at reach blocks? Are you looking at cut blocks? Are you looking at stock blocking? Are you looking at the angles that you take as a blocker to seal? What angles you're supposed to be taking to do that? Do you look at how close you should be, where your hands should be? Do you roll your hips into a punch? Do you even punch? Do you punch with an uppercut or are you punching with a double jab? Do you have a one-arm technique? Do you know when to use these types of techniques? And I think the answer is no most of the time when, this happens. So when I look at a Carson Ryan, and most guys like at this level, I watch the stock blocking because you can see a lot of that out in space. And most of these guys, you can tell who can block and who can't just by how they approach the defender. Do they run down the hill to try and get them right away, or do they meet them halfway and then make the defender make a decision and then they react to that decision, and they're more patient about it. Ryan does that. Ryan is good at being able to like set defenders up, thinking that he's going in one direction, but it's really to set them up to go in another so that he can then seal them to the outside or the inside. You want him to be a puller on the backside, he can do that. You want him to be the lead blocker, he can do that. Put him on pass protection. Oh my God. I mean, I know it's not like he's facing Myles Garrett, and he's never going to win against Myles Garrett. But I watched him against Miami. I watched him against some decent prospects at other schools, and he moves his feet really well. He understands how to be patient and make them go in a certain influence them to go in a direction that he can at least handle. That he's going to put them in a situation, unless they're elite, in a situation where they're going to at least go with the program he's trying to get them to go with, and that gives the quarterback, it's not an easy win. If you have a 6'4", 250 guy who's not an instant win against top E's because what he's doing technically and conceptually, that's good, especially when you see he's great at all the other things that an H-back would be asked to do, or a second tight end. And he's at 250, you can hold up okay if you're part of, a two tight end look, as long as you're not matched up front side on the best guy. And I would even argue his technique's better than most of the guys who are bigger in this class. And then there's just the catch stuff, which is just like, he's not fast. He's not super fast, I don't think, but he's not super slow either. I mean, like he's in that range. He can beat linebackers. He can threaten safeties in certain instances, and he wins downfield. I've watched him uncover on routes where the Utah quarterback is literally like, he's not open, but I'm going to throw this ball 30 yards down the field to him because I know he's going to work open at the last moment because I've worked with this dude enough to know. And not only can he high point and jump up and through and do all these things, but he can literally uncover from a defender within like one step and slip in underneath him and just bring his hands out and literally pull the ball away from the defender, and the defender didn't even know it was coming. He's that kind of like, it's like watching Ladd McConkey in the red zone uncovering for Justin Herbert. I saw like multiple plays like that, and I was like, you got to be kidding me. Like, and it's funny because I don't watch PFF. I don't know what PFF does, but I looked him up to see if there's anything talking about him, and PFF had him as their number one ranked tight end, graded tight end for the season. And I was like, that's interesting because he's good. Like I really liked what I saw, and he reminds me of Jake Ferguson. Like,
oh, that's great.
Like a Jake.
He's a good player,
yes.
Man.
And Jake was an underrated player. I had Jake like 7th, I think, that year as a guy that I was like, this guy can do everything well, maybe not one thing unbelievably well, but he's so good at every aspect that he's going to be hard to take off the field in an offense. And I think Carson Ryan can kind of fit either dynamic that you would choose for him. And, does that make him a fantasy-worthy player? I don't know. It depends where he lands, but it could happen. So I think to me, he's the guy that he may not get drafted. He may not even be draftable because of the fact that he didn't get invited to the combine. But for the life of me, I have no idea why that was based on what I saw. Yeah. So
love it.
Yeah. So listen, folks, always fun check out Brandon's work at Angelo's Analysis. You saw, he's got some good videos that have been coming out that are available for free. And then go subscribe to the work. It's worth every penny. Okay?
Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And then,
Appreciate it.
RSP.
Get the RSP.
April
Get
1.
The RSP.
That's what we're trying to do.
It's not April Fools. Not April Fools.
Nope. So, or maybe the April Fools is on you to think that it was an April Fool's joke, So it's like a double reverse, I guess, maybe. I don't know. The double reverse of draft guides. But but yeah, you can go to mattwaldman.com for that. And, thanks again. We'll be on in a couple of weeks, and we appreciate you and the feedback that you give. And, take care. Have a good weekend.
Sir.
All right.